question. Actually, you couldn't say anything nicer than putting me in the same sentence as Wayne and Megan, because they were mentors of mine, actually. Wayne Michelson at Oregon and Megan Parch. Actually, Wayne Michelson. So I went to graduate school at the University of Chicago, and Wayne Michelson and I, you may not even know this, used to play tennis on an indoor basketball court in Chicago, on the University of Chicago campus, because that was the only place you could play tennis in the winter in Hyde Park, at least at that time. And playing tennis on a basketball court, the ball bounces like, so it was an interesting time, but we had a lot of fun. So what I wanted to talk about was competition in research. I've had more experience than I care to have in this arena, but in the way that I sort of thought about this is because I've had experience, I've thought deeply about these issues over time and across years, and it's something you'll encounter in scholarly work. And I really just wanted to throw the ideas up so that you guys can ask questions and other panelists can chime in, because I think in a lot of these areas there's not right or wrong answers, and that context really matters in how you handle situations. But it's something that I think is good to have an open discussion about. And I think the competitive landscape, just to tee this up, has really changed a lot. When I graduated in 1990 from the University of Chicago, email didn't really exist. There was only hard copies of papers. Conference, seminars, and institutional working paper series provided info on early work. There was no SSRN. Literature searches required trips to the library. Snail mail was used for submission to journals, right? So just think about the flow of information back then. It was very kind of regional. There wasn't this big sort of repository of papers. And so it was just a very different landscape, which I think only a few of us in this room can even relate to. So I think there's some people on the panel that can probably do so. And now in 2016, SSRM posts tons of working papers, right? It's impossible to keep up with all of the working papers that are coming through on SSRM. Google Scholar provides an easy way to access work. And it's kind of hard to prove the non-existence of a paper. So you don't quite know if there's something out there on what you're doing, and you're always kind of afraid that there is something out there on what you're doing. So it's just a totally sort of different landscape now. And so having set the landscape, I guess the way that I think about this, and the way that I think we as a profession should think about this, is our overarching objective. Our overarching objective is to create knowledge, right? And so I think the question we should be asking ourselves is, how do we structure the profession in a way so as to maximize the creation of knowledge and impact? And I think, I don't have a formal model here. I think actually this is a research opportunity to sort of think about these issues in more detail in a theoretical setting. But I think one of the things that we want to do is create an environment of trust and have strong social norms regarding attribution and scholarship. So I think that's one of the overarching things that I want to deliver today, is that we want to share ideas and sort of bad ideas around so that we can create knowledge, but have a strong social norm that if it's your idea, that you don't steal ideas of others or without attribution, et cetera. And that's a really tough balance, because I think a lot of times, I've worked in behavioral finance, we have a tendency to attribute our successes to our own abilities and not to others. So it's very gray in terms of how these ideas get thrown around and what's yours and what's others. Now, the environment that we have now is sort of competition for scholarship, and this is true in many in all academic disciplines. And the bright side is it encourages innovation. Scholars work hard, lots of ideas are thrown out. There are some dark sides, though, and we see this in science more generally. There's incentive for fraud or unethical behavior because you get great rewards for publishing. So it's not surprising that you might see data mining, more nefariously falsifying data, or stealing ideas, right? There's a website called retractionwatch.org that basically publishes retractions of major scientific papers that are done because of these sorts of issues that come up. So it would be silly of us to think these things don't happen. They do happen because the incentives that we face are very high-powered in terms of career success and projection. So we just need to talk about it and be forthright about it. These things do happen. The other thing that I don't think we talk about as quite as much is that the dark side of having sort of this competition is it does create incentives for us individually to create barriers to entry in our own work. And I think the most obvious example of that is sort of data hoarding. I may have a proprietary data set I'm not going to let anyone else use because I want to get as many papers milked out of that data set before somebody else does. And I'll talk a little bit about that issue as well. So I'm going to dig into sort of the dark side here. Pardon me for going a little Harry Potter on you here. But I think this is the side that we want to sort of think about and just be open and talk about the dark side. So data mining. To me, this is a really interesting one as an empiricist. Because I think oftentimes, and I've seen this a lot with people PhD students or with young scholars, they'll run analysis A, then they'll run analysis B, and then they'll run analysis C. C gives you significance. And it's amazing how as human beings we can say C is the right one because I added this new control variable or whatever. And I have to say that just always kind of makes me uncomfortable. In my own work, I can say if I can't get a result to survive, so let me back up. If I get a result that I find intriguing, I usually approach it by saying, can I get that result to go away? Is there a way that I can find that result to go away? So the robustness that I'm running is to try to see if that result survives reasonable robustness. And if it doesn't, I generally don't pursue the topic. And the reason is, when I start going out to give those 5 to 10 seminars, right, or brown bags or whatever, somebody's going to ask me to turn things in a way that the results are going to go away. And if I know that on day one, like, let's just cut your losses and move on. Because you want to be really focusing on something that you're confident is a real empirical result. And I say generally well-intentioned here because I think the really problematic data mining that we see in our profession is that sort of data mining, where people can justify what they're doing in a reasonable way, even to an outside audience. It sounds plausible. And often the papers will be rewritten as if it was ex ante rather than ex post thinking. But that's just, that's kind of data mining that's tough to detect and difficult to as an outsider, identify. So the avoidance here is, I think, really just think carefully about the empirical design and try to avoid this type of data mining. I will say that I think the profession in general is pretty good at rooting out that sort of thing. If you think about the most influential work, I use Gene Flom and Ken French's work on Size to Book the Market because everybody's heard of it, right? They're 93 papers. It's very simple what they do. Ken in particular, but Gene also are huge mentors of mine. I went to Chicago and studied with both of them. And what I really like about the way they approach their research is the first result they give you in a paper is so simple that you could go and replicate it usually in a day or two if you have the data sets available to you. Just sort on size, sort on book to market, you get these huge effects. Guess what? That makes their result really easy for everyone to replicate, to use, to stress test the robustness of, and it's not surprising that their work is therefore influential. And so that's something that I really tried to emanate in my own research, is have a really simple first analysis that will deliver a result that's easy to replicate. Of course, you then need to stress test it and try to get it to go away with all the controls. But if you have a simple message, it really delivers the focused message in a way that convinces readers that you're not data mining, that this is a real economically important result. So if you can't do that, I think the evolution of science and scholarship in general, again, think of us as a community here. We're trying to create knowledge, and I think if you can't stress test a result, that eventually that gets rooted out in subsequent scholarship. The way it gets rooted out is sometimes it gets forgotten, right? Because nobody can build on that if it's not a real idea. That's not terribly satisfying for thinking about, oh, but something wrong got published. But yeah, it was wrong, but it's not influencing the direction of our community and the body of thinking that we have. So that's okay in my mind, right? We have type 1 and type 2 errors in publication, right? What we're doing is creating a body of knowledge and a consensus. So, we're all ants in a giant community trying to create this knowledge. And eventually it gets rooted out. The data hoarding thing here, I want to refer back to. This is, again, creating a barrier to entry. The only thing I'd point out here is it also can create a barrier to influence. And so I think one of the things you want to think about is if you created a really cool data set, is maybe you want to spin out a paper or two, maybe 3 out of that. But at some point, you probably want to share the data, because when you share the data, others can then build on your work in an influential way. And I have to say, this wasn't my doing, but it was my co-author Terry O'Dean's doing. We had the large discount broker data, right? And we wrote a couple papers on it, and we freely share that data, or he freely shares that data now. And I think that was, it was really smart of him to do that, because it's certainly propelled the influence of the early work that Terry did and the early work that both he and I did using that data set. I think that there is a point at which sharing, you don't want to do it right out the box, right? But you might want to do it after you've gotten that first paper, second paper established, so as to increase the influence of the work, or potential impact of the work. Finally, stealing ideas. Let me just say the accusation is much more common in 2016 than it was in 1990, and this is because of the changing landscape. I think that in 1990, the sharing was much more difficult. Remember, we only had hard copies of papers and seminars. So often, if you were in California, you may not be entirely sure what was going on at Rochester, because they'd have to mail stuff back and forth back in those days. In fact, Wayne Michelson once told me the JFE in the 1990s was referred to as Noah's Ark. And the reason it was referred to as Noah's Ark is that was the early days of, I should say 1980s, not 1990s. 1980s was because that was the early days of event studies. And so event study methodology had sort of just come out. This is like the one-day event studies where you look at what happens when there's seasoned equity offerings, for example. I've actually looked back, and there was one issue of the JFE that had 3, not 2, but 3 papers on the announcement returns to seasoned equity offerings. And so basically, all of these papers were coming out at the same time. They were competing for each other for journal space. And typically, they were being published close in proximity to each other, even though that competition was going on. And of course, you always have an identification problem with sort of when 2 papers are competing. Is the idea shared and then stolen, or did scholars independently come up with the idea? And I think back in the 1990s, the presumption was scholars independently came up with the idea because you couldn't see everything on the internet and the posting wasn't there. Now I think there's many more, it feels like there's more accusations, maybe because this happened to me. There's more accusations of ideas being stolen these days because of the changing environment. So obviously it's unethical to steal ideas, and I think it's important to acknowledge the work of others. And I'm really happy to sort of report the AFA Code of Ethics has come out yesterday. I'm sure many of you saw this. I encourage you to read it. This has been an effort that's been going on for probably a year or two, since January 2015, to develop this. And I just pulled out some of the stuff here that I think is you should read the whole thing because it's overarching and really covers many areas of our profession. And again, we're a community, and I think having these sorts of guidelines is really, really useful as a starting point. But some of the important stuff for this particular topic is, first, financial economists should not selectively report findings in ways that would mislead or deceive readers. That's the data mining issue, right? Second, financial economists should explicitly identify credit and reference the author when they take data or material verbatim from another person's written work, whether it is published, unpublished, or electronically available, and acknowledge and reference the use of others' work. That's the stealing ideas part, right? So obviously, clearly that's unethical, and the AFA has adopted policies in line with that. Third, financial economists should take responsibility and credit only for work where they have actually performed and to which they have contributed. And an example that is given is financial economists should not pressure their junior colleagues or advisees to be added to a paper. So this is something that many of you may be encountering now, where you're working with an advisor. You know, the advisor doesn't do a whole lot and wants to be on the paper. You know, that again is considered an example of an ethical breach. The advisor should only be added to the paper if, in fact, they're doing substantive work on the paper. It may be in the form of writing, it may be in the form of design, it may be in the form of actual empirical analysis. But really, you know, you should think carefully about that and think about whether that contribution is being made. And you have guidance now from the professional association to sort of back you up. Finally, financial economists should work to provide an environment that encourages the free expression and exchange of scientific ideas. Again, I think there's this notion, there's this tension between being afraid of your ideas being stolen and sharing your ideas. And where we would like to get, I think, is where we have a social norm that that doesn't happen, but of course, there's always that threat, so that we feel that we can share ideas without the fear of having them stolen. So practically, where do you take? So I've sort of teed up these issues. We can have more discussions among panelists about these issues. But practically for you guys, I think a couple issues that come up. When do you post to the SSRN? Do you post early? Do you post late? And I have to say my behavior has changed over time. So let me just lay out the pros and the cons of when to post. The pro of posting early is you mark your territory. You can clearly establish the first date of a working paper. The cons are quality, reputation. Your work may be half-baked and not reflect well on you. And you have some appropriation risk, right? Because others might steal the idea or have a better data set method theory to answer the question you pose. So if you think about this in terms of marking your territory, and if I think about this as an economics model, you know, you might have a degenerative equilibrium where you post 2 sentences saying, I analyzed the announcement returns to seasoned equity offerings. That's my territory. Nobody else can do it, right? But well, what if it's a page long and has 1 table? Have I marked my territory? In other words, when is the barrier to entry created? When is the sort of IP created? That's a really tough one. I don't have a good answer to it. I'd really be interested to hear what other panelists think about that. So marking your territory, I think, is a little bit vague here in terms of how substantive does it have to be when you post. I guess for me, I think it has to be reasonably substantive, that you've actually done substantive analysis and it's a proper working paper, but that's a matter of judgment. I don't have a really good sense of what to tell you about that. In terms of quality reputation, this trade-off here, my behavior has changed dramatically over time. And the reason is because of SSRN and people using SSRN to sort of post territory. Back 10, even 5 years ago, I would say, I would really hold papers quite long before I posted, because I only wanted something to be very polished and reflect well on my abilities before I posted, because I'm a bit of a perfectionist in those regards. But now I'm posting much earlier and much more schlockily, to borrow a phrase, because people are using it to sort of identify sort of the marking the territory bit. So, it's changed my behavior. I don't know if it's better or worse. I'm just telling you what's happened. This is how I have changed my behavior. So those are the sort of pros and cons. Second thing, practically, what to do when there is competition. I think really contacting the authors of the competing team immediately is a good starting point. I think that is Opening up the lines of communications is uncomfortable when this is going on, but important. And that can lead to several possible outcomes. One is collaboration. I know of specific examples where papers have been merged because there are two competing papers. I'll give you two examples off the top of my head. One is Anna Sherbina, my colleague at UC Davis. Her dissertation was on disagreement and the effect that that has on returns. As it turns out, Chris Malloy had a competing paper on the exact same topic, and Carl Dieter. And this became a merged paper that's been highly influential on the effect of differences of opinion. So they decided to merge their separate papers, even though they were both sort of coming out as PhDs or early assistant professors. I don't know exact timing. Anna was a PhD student. I'm not sure about the others. I believe they were early assistant professors, but they merged it. Another example is Charles Lee at Stanford had a paper on the anatomy of analyst recommendations. Jagadish at Emory had a similar paper. They both submitted to the JF, and through the submission process, the editor said, let's merge these papers because they're sufficiently close. So these types of things happen, not commonly, but there are certainly examples. You can also coordinate submissions, and I can give my own example here. Soren Wittker at Maryland had a paper using TAC data, small trades in TAC, to identify the trading of individual investors. Terry Ning Zhu and I had a similar paper, and we became aware of each other's work about the same time, and we had a very sort of collaborative solution. So we contacted each other. We were sharing data sets, Soren and our team, and we coordinated submission to the Review of Financial Studies so that we'd have a correlated outcome, hopefully. We can't guarantee that, but we submitted to the RFS at the same time within a week of each other. And because we had such a good open communication between the competing teams. I think that's unusual. You have to have a really high level of trust between both of the two teams to do that. But it worked really well in that particular situation for us. So if you have that trust, you can also navigate a situation like that. But frankly, the most common outcome is you're competing. Ball's on your, pardon the French, you're competing with some other group. It's uncomfortable. It's not fun. You have some sleepless nights, and it's kind of a race to a publication. The only consolation I can say in those situations is this too shall pass. You get over it and you move on. Often multiple papers are published on an important topic. And it's stressful for the authors, but it's perhaps good for the profession. And this is something that is kind of hard to see when you're in the middle of it, but actually having two separate teams look at a particular issue increases the probability that we learn the truth and the knowledge is created in a way that moves the field forward. So I think it can be good for the profession to have this sort of competition, even if it's very closely aligned on the same topic. By the way, these sort of norms vary by academic discipline. And just to show you this, I pulled off the submission guidelines for science. I think most would agree is one of the premier outlet for academic work. And science says we generally encourage presentation of original results prior to publication at scientific meetings. Nevertheless, press coverage and presentation at scientific conferences can sometimes affect consideration of papers at science. They also say down here, distribution on the internet may be considered prior publication and may compromise the originality of the paper as a submission to science. And finally, papers will be held for publication until all in-press citations are published. This is very different from social sciences, right? We post our stuff up, we present it for a year or two before we submit sometimes. In scientific disciplines, they don't post anything. I remember one time I actually had a working paper that I think was being covered by the Wall Street Journal, and the press person on my campus, UC Davis, called me and said, are you sure that that's okay? Because it hasn't been published yet. We're a very science-focused campus. So, they really want to be tight-lipped about stuff before it actually is covered in the press. And as fate would have it, I have one project I'm working on now that I want to submit to science, and I can't tell you about it. And it's not on SSRN. Okay. So a couple cases. This is just to tee it up to the panelists. Case one, the unlucky PhD student. Srikar works hard to hand collect data on a sample of firms for 12 months. He's done empirical analysis, generated several tables using the data. He then learns of a competing paper on the same topic. What does Srikar do? And I guess here it's a tough one, right? Because you really need to know a lot about context. My general advice would be seek advice from your advisors, senior scholars, and more than one person if possible, and try to listen and be objective. These are really emotionally charged situations, and just try to take a step back from the emotion and get rid of the emotion of it, because that's very hard to do. But you want to try to be as objective as possible in a situation like this. And getting perspective from people outside the situation is really important for that reason. But questions to consider: can you differentiate the paper? Is it the same data set, the same hypotheses, same methodology, same results, same conclusion? Usually the answer to one of those questions is no, which means there's going to be room for you to differentiate the paper. And you just really want to drive that differentiation as strongly as possible. And this is, does my paper, the questions following are similar. Does the paper make a distinct and important contribution? Is my paper contemporaneous? That's subjective. Was it posted a day after the other paper on SSRN or a month? The profession doesn't have firm guidelines about what contemporaneous is. Was my paper more complete than the other paper? Those sorts of things would enter into whether you think it's contemporaneous or not. But that, again, is a matter of subjective judgment at the end of the day. It's not black or white. And finally, is there a sunk cost? Is it really like you go through these questions and it's like, man, this is my paper. Then you might want to just cut bait, because you don't want to fall victim to sunk cost. Hold on to a project that you really are not going to have much success moving along if you continue to pursue it, because there are other things that you would be able to use that time for that. Case two is sort of the flip side of this. Frances posted an early draft of her dissertation to SSRN. Some months later, she learns that two senior scholars posted a draft with similar motivation and results without citing her paper. What should Frances do? I just cut and paste the first part. Seek advice. Your advisors, senior scholars, multiple people, listen and be objective. Again, it's the same thing. Take a deep breath. Don't react. Don't be reactive, because when you're emotional, you're likely to make or say things that you might regret later. So just sort of hold tight and get advice. And almost certainly, you want to send the paper to the competing authors and request that they cite you. I recommend that you draft an email, have someone review the email before you send it to make sure it's not confrontational or overly. Remember, we're a community. We want to try to develop a sense of rapport in these things. Most people are quite reasonable if you approach them reasonably. And so you want to be careful about that correspondence. If you feel strongly about how you should be cited, I think it's fine to suggest citation language. Say, it'd be great if you could cite me like this. They may come back and say, well, we'd like to cite you like this, but engage in the conversation. This goes in line with immediately contacting the authors and trying to develop a working relationship, because you'll be able to, in most cases, you'll be able to work with the competing team if you establish a rapport with them. Doesn't always work, but occasionally, generally, I think most people, it will. And that's it. This was just the example of the 3 SEO papers. Wayne Michelson and Megan Parch was one of the 3. You might enjoy that piece of trivia. Okay, so questions, and folks, I'd also be interested to hear other panelists' comments on these topics.
Thanks, Bert.
Sure.